Good morning. All right. My lecture is called Prince Myshkin in California, and it's in reference to the protagonist of this novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Idiot. Has anybody here read The Idiot? A surprisingly number of you. That's great. I found this particular copy of The Idiot at a jumble sale. As you can perhaps see, it's beat up, dog-eared, yellowed, and swollen due to contact with water, a dousing that took place at some time over the 42 years since it was printed in 1970. As I say, I found it at a jumble sale. It cost me $0.25. It's the Fyodor Dostoevsky novel, The Idiot, a classic of world literature, reduced by time and chance to what Philip K. Dick called the trash stratum, where he famously told us in Valis, the symbols of the divine show up amid, as he put it in Radio Free Albemuth, flattened beer cans and papers and weeds and junk mail. Its translation is by David Magerschak, dating to 1955, which is appropriate as much of my discussion today will be on Philip Dick's short stories and novels of the 1950s, particularly The Cosmic Puppets and The Man Who Japed. Those stories and novels may now be printed on fine paper in deluxe uniform editions, but they are still pure emanations from the trash stratum, the pulp fiction of its day. The Idiot, by contrast, is, according to Dostoevsky scholar Joseph Frank, the most personal of all his major works, the book in which he embodies his most intimate, cherished, and sacred convictions. Readers who took this work to their hearts were, he must have felt, a select group of kindred souls with whom he could truly communicate. That secret communication between author and audience was at the heart of Dick's fandom while he was alive, and obviously is still very much with us today. Reading The Idiot, and I did read the beat-up paperback I did encounter by chance, I was struck by one passage in particular. The saintly epileptic Prince Myshkin, on the verge of a seizure, is struck by something that interested him exceedingly. He remembered that at the moment when he became aware that he was looking for something, he was standing on the pavement in front of a shop window and examining the things in it with great interest. He felt he simply had to find out whether he really had stood just now before that shop window, perhaps 5 minutes before, or whether he had imagined it all or got it all mixed up. Did that shop and the things in its window really exist? Compare this passage from The Cosmic Puppets, Philip Dick's novel of 1955. Ted Barton has returned to his hometown of Millgate, but nothing is as he remembers it. All strange, alien, he thinks. He looks at the hardware store next to the bar. It was old, an ancient wood building, leaning and sagging, its yellow paint peeled off. He could make out a dim interior, harnesses, farm equipment, tools, cans of paint, faded calendars on the walls. Behind the fly-specked window was a display of fertilizers and chemical sprays. Dead insects lay in heaps in the corners, spider webs, warped cardboard signs. It was an old store, old as hell. But the store hadn't existed in Ted's childhood, and he goes on to discover that what had once been Doyle's Leather Goods was now a rundown bar, a radio store, a hand laundry, and what had once been his boyhood town was decayed and isolated. Both Ted Barton and Prince Myshkin are forced to wonder as to whether what they are looking at was real. Both Barton and the Prince use a display of consumer goods as an anchor to reality. But what is real and what illusion? Both men's probing of these questions is central to their achievements. Reality, Philip Dick famously said, is what doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. One of the Idiot's secondary characters, the dying atheist Ippolit, puts it this way: reality has been trying to catch me, too. Late in the novel, the prince observes, the most fantastic dream became suddenly transformed into the most sharply defined reality. But what is reality? That's Philip Dick's great question. While writing The Idiot, Dostoevsky responded to a friend who had queried the extreme developments in his friend's novel in progress, replying that he had a different conception of reality than most authors, than his critics. He had a conception of what he called a fantastic reality. Dick and Dostoevsky, then, both wrote novels of a fantastic reality. But realism for Dostoevsky never meant the acceptance of the factual and literal in itself. It meant, rather, its transformation in the light of what he called the beginnings and ends of factuality, its significance in a larger framework of moral religious meaning. Dostoevsky's realism inevitably became fantastic because he was always reaching out to grasp the ultimate meaning of both beginnings and ends. Philip Dick and Fyodor Dostoevsky are very different artists operating in very different times, yet they have enough in common to be worth looking at what they shared. Both, quite obviously, were visionary novelists who suffered inordinately in their lifetime and died too soon. Both men's reputations soared after their deaths. Both had equivocal relationships with their powerful governments. Both acquired intense cult followings. And both shared certain themes. I'd like to return to the items Ted Barton observes in the window of the town in Cosmic Puppets. This use of ordinary household objects as a marker of reality and how reality can change in Philip Dick's writing. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin, peering through a similar window, looks worriedly for an article worth no more than 60 kopecks. Its existence will be proof that he had indeed stood in front of the shop and looked at that item. If that item isn't there, however, then the prince will be lost in utter confusion. No wonder he retraces his steps, looking for that item, looking almost in anguish. Now, this links up with another recurring theme in Dick's writing, his fondness for small-scale entrepreneurial capitalists who, as he once phrased it, after the apocalypse will be crawling out of the rubble, ready to sell you a rewired radio. These good capitalists produce worthy pieces of jewelry, like Frank Frink in The Man of the High Castle, while a system's phoniness is illustrated by the junk it produces that falls apart, like the copies that puddle in the short story Pay for the Printer. This can be generalized to a critique of the shift promoted by large-scale industrialized capitalism, a process that was already underway at the time, the 1860s, when Dostoevsky wrote The Idiot. Indeed, a minor character in that novel, Lebedev, identifies the star that is called Wormwood from the Book of Revelations with a network of railways spread all over Europe. As he complains, they hustle, they roar, they rend the air with their noise, they hurry, they say, for the happiness of mankind. What caused this shift from handmade goods to mass-produced junk? Those very engines of progress Lebedev complains of. More specifically, in Dick's writing, it's the forces of consumerism, in particular advertising, that forces his transition. Several of Dick's early stories overtly satirize the high-pressure salesmanship of 1950s television and mass media generally, as, for example, Sales Pitch, wherein the new self-aware product, the fast rad, chases down and forces itself on its target. The flip side of this are Philip Dick's creditor jet balloons who follow debtors around demanding money. I'm sure we'll be seeing those in our lives before very long. Dick's most thoroughgoing critique of 1950s consumerism is his 1956 novel, The Man Who Japed, one of several works by Philip Dick in which ad men are the Madison Avenue manipulators of the future. Alan Purcell, the Don Draper of the future, and like the protagonist of Mad Men, possessed of two identities, is the protagonist of The Man Who Japed, an ad man who devises propaganda for a future authoritarian state. As such, he is a recurring figure in Dick's fiction, to be seen again as the tormented Yance man Joseph Adams in The Penultimate Truth, 1964, and as a simulacrum of Philip Dick himself in Radio Free Albemuth, written 1975. Purcell unconsciously revolts against the social role by, while in his sleep japing, splashing with paint, decapitating, and later stealing the head of a statue of society's hero figure, Major Jules Streicher. His unconscious conscience forces him to revolt. Streiter's name is a direct reference to the Nazi Julius Streicher, a notorious sexual pervert. In Dick's novel, Major Streiter is the founder of his government's ideology, the puritanical and repressive MOREC, moral reclamation, based on a popular 1950s mass movement. Prince Mishkin and some of the other positive characters in The Idiot also advocate such a movement for Russia, a marker of Dostoevsky's ambiguous relationship with the state. Purcell's separation, while unconscious, of Major Streiter's head from Major Streiter's body, that is to say, he steals the head of the statue of Major Streiter, is a brilliant visualization of the separation in mind and body central to Western culture since at least Descartes. And everyone who's studied Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is aware of the call-out to René Descartes in the character of Rick Deckard. The novel also anticipates the author's embrace of the youth culture of the 1960s. The totalitarian world of Morek is presented in The Man Who Japed as the end result of the eating of the young by the old. This future society's sullen adolescents and children are Alan Purcell's hopes for the future. The teenage boys Alan meets during an amnesic spell are anxious to escape Morek. Late in the book, a 9-year-old boy, initials RP, the initials of Dick's one-time pseudonym, Richard Phillips, is apprehended for scrawling pornographic words on a bathroom wall. It are these teenagers and the boy who are the book's true hopes for the future, even as Dick would appeal to the hell-raising capability of anarchist youth in his Vancouver speech of 1972 as his hope for Vietnam-era America's future. The Man Who Japed builds to Purcell's ultimate jape against the government, a coordinated ad campaign that reveals to the public, to much whipped-up attention, that Major Strider had advocated during the chaotic period after the atomic war, that Major Strider had advocated and practiced active assimilation as part of his post-atomic war program. Active assimilation is revealed to be cannibalism. Cannibalism, of course, is perhaps the ultimate dehumanizing crime. Seeking to outrage the provocateur Lebedev in The Idiot compares his times with that of 12th century Russia, ridden with famines. He dilates on the confession of a ne'er-do-well from that era who had survived multiple famines in his long life through cannibalism, killing and consuming in secret 60 monks and several lay infants, but no more than 6 of the infants. Morek, meanwhile, is defined by Alan Purcell as gobbling greedily at the human soul, and thus can be defined as at least spiritual cannibalism, as in another of Dick's novels, Palmer Eldritch's Religion of Himself. Alan Purcell remarks of Strider's statue that it was designed to always appear looking into the future, while in The Man in the High Castle, the Nazis who rule the world are said to control the future, to be as God. God has eaten man, that book tells us. Thus we have another recurring theme shared by both authors, that of time, a theme also common to many creative people down to the present time. Prince Mishkin perceives time as slowing down to a stop just before one of his seizures. And I would direct you to his brilliant description of that state in Part 2, Chapter 5 of The Idiot. See, I have a little time here, so I'll share that with you. Let's see here. He was thinking, incidentally, that there was a moment or two in his epileptic condition almost before the fit itself, if it occurred during his waking hours, when suddenly amid the sadness, spiritual darkness, and depression, his brain seemed to catch fire at brief moments, and with an extraordinary momentum, his vital forces were strained to the utmost all at once. His sensation of being alive and his awareness increased tenfold at those moments which flashed by like lightning. His mind and heart were flooded by a dazzling light. All his agitation, all his doubts and worries seemed composed in a twinkling, culminating in a great calm, full of serene and harmonious joy and hope, full of understanding and the knowledge of the final cause. But those moments, those flashes of intuition, were merely the presentiment of the last second, never more than a second, which preceded the actual fit. This second was, of course, unendurable. Reflecting about that moment afterwards, when he was well again, he often said to himself that all those gleams and flashes of the highest awareness, and hence also of the highest mode of existence, were nothing but a disease, a departure from the normal condition, and if so, it was not at all the highest mode of existence, but on the contrary, must be considered to be the lowest. And yet he arrived at last at the paradoxical conclusion. What if it is a disease, he decided at last? What does it matter that it is an abnormal tension if the result, if the moment of sensation, remembered and analyzed in a state of health, turns out to be harmony and beauty brought to their highest point of perfection, and gives a feeling, undivined and undreamt of, till then, of completeness, proportion, reconciliation, and an ecstatic and powerful, prayerful fusion in the highest synthesis of life. Now, those of you who are aware of Philip Dick's Valis event of 1974 can draw the parallels yourself. I take no position on the claim, which I don't necessarily agree with, that Dick suffered an epileptic seizure in February 1974. Rather, I instead point to the claim by the dying Ippolit later on in The Idiot. Tomorrow there will be time no longer. Joseph Frank writes, "The Prince incarnates the soul of the primitive Christian ethic, whose doctrine of totally selfless agape, of holy love, was conceived in the same perspective of the imminent end of time. The end of time." Dostoevsky wrote The Idiot concerned with trying to present the dilemma of the purely good person in a less than perfect world. One here compares Dostoevsky with the Dick of the Valis period and after, particularly Dick's last months, with his predictions of the imminent return of Christ. Mishkin's life ends tragically, but for Dostoevsky, poised to write his final pages, this in no way undermines the transcendent ideal of Christian love that he tries to bring to the world, and whose full realization is beyond the power of any earthly human to achieve. Compare the prince's sufferings with that of Tagore in the letter Philip Dick sent to the 85 people in his address book less than a year before he died. Some of you may be aware of the Tagore letter. It's a document that Phil wrote in September of 1981, shortly before he passed. And in his persona of Horse Lover Fat, he sent a letter that he had had a vision of a new savior born in Ceylon, who was suffering from the pains of atomic waste cast into the ocean. Tagore teaches, and this is from the letter that he wrote, and he wrote it, and it's almost a futile gesture against the enormity of the crime against the world ecology that was being conducted at the time. He sent this to the 85 people who happened to be in his address book. Tagore teaches, he wrote, that when the atmosphere is burned, God himself is burned, for the Christ has invaded the ecosphere and inevitably assimilated to itself through transubstantiation, which is the great vision Horse Lover Fat has in my novel Valis. Thus, Christ and the ecosphere are either a one or rapidly becoming one, such as Teilhard de Chardin describes in The Phenomenon of Man. The ecosphere does not evolve into the cosmic Christ, however. Christ penetrates it, which is exactly what Fat saw and which so amazed him. Thus, Christ now speaks out, not just for the salvation of mankind or certain men, the elect, but for the ecosphere as a whole, from the snail darter on up. So, the holy and transcendent state that the idiot, the Prince Mishkin, achieves in his epileptic state is matched by the holy state of identification with the suffering ecosphere that Philip Dick achieved in his late writing after 1974. I want to draw those parallels, and you can make the connections yourself. Perhaps one day, Philip Dick will be thought of as being, to his own time, what such a witness-victim genius as Fyodor Dostoevsky was to his. Today, when we think of Dostoevsky, we think of the social democrat sent to Siberia for 10 years, a powerful witness to the sufferings of the dispossessed. We may also think of the later Dostoevsky, the mystic who all but worshipped the forces that had exiled him. Contradictory? Yes, but equally so is Philip K. Dick. Thank you. David? I will take a question or a statement or a comment.
Questions? Nobody has questions.
Over here in the corner.
I remember that in the first volume of the selected letters, there are, I don't remember if one or two or three letters where he talks about his favorite writers. For example, that's where I found that he had read Hans Pallada, just to name a name. Have you found any traces of Dostoevsky?
Yes. In my biography, he talked about all the writers that he'd read and consumed, and he did mention Dostoevsky. And and someone was talking about James Joyce in the aisle behind me when I was waiting for the startup, and he said Joyce above all in the same conversation, but he did mention Dostoevsky as a writer who he had read. I don't know for sure that he read The Idiot. He may very well have. He was very widely read. Okay. Good question. Yes? Oh, I like the Cosmic Puppets very much. I reread it like a week or two ago in preparation for this, and it held up really well. It was originally written in 1953, I believe, and it was put out as an ace double in 57. And one reason it fell out of the canon, it isn't that well known, is that it wasn't reissued until 1983 when they got around to looking for Philip Dick material. And I asked Donald Wollheim, who published the ace series of novels, and mostly those paperback originals that Phil wrote in the 50s. I asked Donald Wollheim, well, why hadn't the Cosmic Puppets been reprinted? And he said, well, I forgot about it. So that's the only reason that it had, had fallen out of the canon. Is not as well known as, say, Eye in the Sky, or some of his other better known 50s novels. Also, it's somewhat anomalous. I'm not aware of the discussion online, but it's somewhat anomalous to his science fiction work because he wrote it as a fantasy. As a teenage boy, Phil was a big fan of Unknown, which was a fantasy magazine, a fantasy pulp that was being put out at the same time as Astounding and the other science fiction pulps, and from some of the same people and with a lot of the same authors. But it's not science fiction; it's fantasy. I mean, we still make the distinction now, even though we slide back and forth between them, in our movie going or whatever. But it's still a distinction between Asimov and Tolkien or whatever when they do adaptations. Yeah, he wrote it as a fantasy, and it is play out as a fantasy. Yeah, a theological fantasy. Which definitely you'll see a lot of themes in it that you see in his later work. If you know Dr. Mead, he's the amnesiac who forgets that he's God. That's what could be more Dickian than that? Some other comment, question?
My only hope was, could you repeat the questions when somebody gives?
Oh, okay. Yeah, he asked about the status of the cosmic puppets and if he thought it should be if I thought it should be in the canon, which I guess is the canon being what the major Philip Dick novels. And I'd put it in the major Philip Dick novels of the 50s. If they ever do a Library of America selection of the 50s novels, I put it in there. Anything else? Yes, way in the back, David.
Can you tell us the story of how you got in contact with Philip?
Oh, okay, sure. I was a fan, like a lot of you. I became a Philip Dick fan through the chance encounter. And I walked into a bookstore in San Francisco, Nob Hill, and they had 3 Philip Dick novels, on the paperback rack. And my only previous encounter with Philip Dick had been when I was a teenager, and I remember seeing Ubik on the paperback rack at the May Company. And I remember picking up Ubik at the time and saying, "Oh, this is kind of interesting," but I didn't read it. I didn't get around to buying it. But this is like, what, 10 years later, and I saw these 3 novels, and I said, "Oh, I'll take these home." And I read them, and I liked them a lot. And as you know, you read one Philip Dick novel, you want to read all of Philip Dick novels. They replicate inside of you. And so I hunted them out, and at the time they weren't all in print in nice shiny editions. They were in beat-up paperbacks, and you had to scrounge around for a lot of them. They were very hard. Some of them were hard to find. And I still remember the joy I had in finding a copy of Galactic Pot Healer in San Rafael, at a bookstore up there, used bookstore up there. So having read them all, I wrote up an analysis of them, and at the time, I was friendly with a man named Bill Blackbeard. And those of you who are comics fans will know who Bill Blackbeard was. He lived out here in the Sunset, and he had this huge mansion that was devoted to comic books, and he had and comic strips. He had this huge collection of comic strips that he'd cut from old newspapers, and so he had a complete run of Popeyes and a complete run of Dick Tracy's or whatever, things that hadn't been republished, as well as comic books. And so as a sort of a low-key comics fan, I like really old stuff, Seagar and Kaufman, Crazy Cat, that sort of stuff. I'd gone out to his place to look at some stuff, so I asked him, "Do you happen to know how to get a Philip Dick?" And he gave me his address, his P.O. box in Santa Ana. And so I sent him a copy saying, here's a piece I wrote on your stuff. I hope you like it. And then one day the phone rang, and I picked it up with Philip Dick on the other line. And he said, "Hi, my name is Phil. I like what you wrote." And so I said, "Well, wow, thank you." And so I asked him if I could interview him. So I went out and chatted with him, got to know him a little bit in 1981. So that's the story. All right. Yeah.
Just a minor comment. The name of the character would be Tagore, not Tagore.
Okay.
Presumably, one would think that he picked up the idea from the famous novelist Rabindranath Tagore. But actually, it's hard to say because the original name of the family was Thakur Mashai, which means holy saint or something like that. And they were actually a prominent Bengali family who were involved in creating a syncretic religion called Brahmoism, which combined elements of Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, which is quite interesting. So whether he was actually channeling something about some reality, Sri Lanka is not that far from Bengal, and whether there is a Tagore or a Thakur waiting to show up, I don't know. Somewhere between 76 and 80, one of my visits to him, he did speak about a revelation in which he saw essentially the Buddha being reborn in the garden. And of course, he talked about the palm tree garden and so forth. And I think he was identifying that with this Tagore character.
Mm-hmm.
My own personal take is some of his utterances were prophetic. I have yet to see this character from 30 years ago show up, but there were a lot of similar themes at that time, which is why he was attracted to the Benjamin Bunn crowd, who believed that the Christ was going to reincarnate as the Maitreya.
I think Phil was way ahead of the curve in predicting the ecological destruction of the Earth. I was just looking at how on Daily Cost this morning and how the ice cap will be gone in 5 years. So I mean, we're really screwed. So, but Phil saw it. Phil saw this 30 years ago. So.
There is an eco-Christianity as well. I think he was way ahead of the curve.
All right. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you, David. Oh, one more. All right. Oh well, I have my projected book is on my computer. It's 600 pages, and you can come over and read it sometime. All right.